Hi, it's Rob from the Bush and Boltgun. Today I'm going to be doing a tutorial on how to paint a Necron Overlord. If you like the channel and you'd like to support us, our Ko-fi and Patreon pages are linked below. Now onto the video. First colour we're using on this guy is going to be Vallejo Black, and it's going to be used to do all of the sections between the armour plates on the miniature. So you've got kind of like around the knees and the hips, the elbows, the hands, the shoulders, and that kind of lumpy spine bit going down the back too. Now you can do metallic hands on him if you want to. I tend to do the hands black except for that little piece of armour on the back of the hand. So the fingers, rather than being kind of that gold armour colour, will just be black and greys, and then you'll have the armour colour on the back of the hand. Next I'm going to use some Canoptek alloy. I'm going to use this to do the loincloth kind of bit down the front, and also the big wide shoulders at the back too, and his face. Also going to do that little weird thing that he's got on his hand there too. Paint that in the same colour. With that done, we're now going to use some Citadel Retributor armour. I'm going to use this to do the two kind of tassel things going down his front, and a few of the smaller details like the crest across the top of his head as well. We're going to be using that on that. Let's give them a nice smooth layer of Citadel Retributor armour. Now we're going to use some Vallejo White to paint a few little bits. This is going to be to do some cables, his eyes. Then there's a few of those glowing globes. One on the hand there, one on each shoulder. Going to paint that big smooth tube that runs from his back to the staff as well. There's also a stripe of white down his head there too. I'm going to use some Citadel Ahriman blue to paint up the little discs on those tassels at the front. Could be doing these as little blue gemstones like we did with the Necron Overlord some time ago. Like so. Next up we have Citadel Moot green. I'm going to use this to paint the blades on the Hyperphase Glaive that he's got there. You've got the smaller blade at the bottom, also the larger blade at the top. So give them a nice smooth coat of Moot green. And what you might find is that if you've used the Runelord Brass spray, you might find that you need to do 2 layers of Moot green on this just so that it gives a nice smooth coat. With the Moot green done, we're now going to use some Citadel Lead Belcher. I'm going to use this to do parts of the glaive, also parts of the tubing and stuff like that on the miniature. Next up we're going to start with the shades. We're going to use Citadel Cryptek Armourshade. This is the shade that was released with the Necrons. It's a gloss shade. It gives a nice little kind of shiny brown stain to the armour. Allows you to see the metallic through it, which is really nice. It gives a good base for when you start reapplying those metallics to build up the layers again. Now we have Citadel Drakenhof Nightshade. I'm going to use this to paint each of those little Ahriman blue gems on those tassels. Can you hear any background noise here? I've got a small cat harassing me as always. Now we're going to use Citadel Biel-Tan green, and we're going to use this to go over the Moot green. Mainly going to try and keep this in the recesses initially, as we will be reapplying some Moot green to go over the bits that we've made. So you can pin shade this if you want. I just find it easier to do it this way, a little bit quicker, and then when you're reapplying that Moot green, you can just reapply that to the smoother areas. Going to use a little bit of Biel-Tan green at the top and bottom and in the middle of some of these sections on the tube too. That means when we apply the Tesseract glow, you'll have that nice darker bit at the end and in the middle as well. Now I'm going to use some Citadel Agrax Earthshade, and we're going to use this to colour the gold and shade it in those recesses. This gives the gold a nice dark colour, like so. Now we're going to use Citadel Nuln Oil, and this is going to be to use on all of the lead belcher sections. Now we're going to start reapplying some colour. We're going to use Citadel Runelord Brass. This is the same spray that I sprayed the miniature with prior to starting. What we're going to do here is we're going to reapply this to the top edges and the areas that are going to be catching most light on the miniature. So the light is catching those, and you can see the brass colour there. While the areas sort of under the legs and under the arms, under the torso, are going to have less of the colour reapplied and mainly going to be shaded because they wouldn't be getting too much light. With that finished, we're going to move on to Citadel Canoptek Alloy. We're now going to highlight this, doing about maybe 50% of the area we've just covered with the Runelord Brass. We are now going to cover 50% of that with Canoptek Alloy. You'll be reapplying a bit more of this on the areas where you initially put the Canoptek Alloy, like the head and the big shoulders and bits at the back. I'm going to use some Vallejo Model Air Chrome. I'm going to use this to do some of the little pistons and shiny details which are on the miniature. You find these on each leg, one of the kind of shin bones, and then you've got a piston on each side of the neck. I'm also going to use this to do the little Necron kind of badges on the chest. You'll also have one on the glaive as well, near the top, on each side. Because of how shiny this is, it helps these stand out really, really well against that black background. It's a great colour to use for those. We're now going to mix a little bit of Vallejo Model Air Chrome with the Canoptek Alloy and just do the final layer of highlights on the armour. For this, because it is the final highlight, you want to be thinking about which areas are going to catch the most light, so you're going to have the top edges of things. So all those little details, you can pick out the top edges of them so that they stand out and they've got that shine to them. Now I'm going to use Citadel Retributor Armour, start working on the gold again. So the gold is going to be on these tassels. You're going to be leaving the shade in the areas that aren't going to get that much light, and then reapplying the Retributor Armour to the areas that are. So I'm trying to leave a little bit shaded on each of these kind of sections, just so you have got a little bit of that shade showing. But as they curve, you'll be able to do certain areas with more light catching it and certain areas with less. To highlight this, we are going to be using Citadel Liberator Gold. You want to be covering about 50% of the previous layer with the Liberator Gold. This layer starts to bring out the highlights quite nicely and gives a lot of shine to these gold sections. And on the next layer, that will really make that stand out and make that shine a lot. Final section for the gold, we are going to add some Vallejo Model Air Chrome. I'm going to mix that to the Liberator Gold. Now we're just going to be doing edge highlights much like we did on the armour. We're going to be doing that on the gold. So you can paint top edges and surfaces that are going to be catching a lot of light with this, and this will give it a really good shine. You also want to be catching those top edges underneath the gems and in between each of those sections to make those stand out and give them a nice glowing shine too. Here we're actually using Vallejo German Grey to highlight the black sections on the armour, or on the miniature I should say. The German Grey is very dark grey, so it goes nicely over that black. So prior to this layer, if you need to pick out any sections that you might have gone onto the black, you can recolour those and then start using the German Grey after that. But it wasn't too bad here, so I just started straight with the German Grey. That's what we're working on at the moment. Now we're going to use some Citadel Mechanicus Standard Grey. I'm going to use this to pick out the details on those sections that we just used the German Grey on. So all of that kind of black skeleton, I'm going to be picking out the top edges again, like you did on the gold and on the armour, just to make those stand out and give them a little bit more shape and definition. Mechanicus Standard Grey done. We are now going to move on to Citadel Ahriman Blue. With this we're just going to be painting the sort of bottom left half of each of these gemstones. So you're leaving that shaded Ahriman Blue in the top right. We're now going to add a little bit of Vallejo White to the Ahriman Blue. I'm going to paint about 50% of the previous layer with this. So just that little crescent on the bottom left of each of these gemstones. Obviously if you don't want to do these, you don't have to. This is just a little bit of extra colour I added to the model. We're now going to add a little bit more white to the previous mix to lighten that up. And we're going to do a very small highlight to the previous layer on the bottom left of each of those gemstones once more. And finally we're just going to use some pure white. We're just going to do a tiny little highlight on the bottom left of each of those sections and a spot of white on the top right of each of the gemstones. And that will be the final highlights for each one and give them the look as though they are reflecting the light. So that once you've finished it, it'll just look like some cool little gemstones set into that section of the miniature. Now I'm going to work on the green sections of the glaive. I'm going to be replacing the Moot green and just painting that around the areas with the Biel-Tan green shade in the recesses. So basically just going over all of these sections where the Biel-Tan green has gone onto the blade, just to give that a nice smooth colour to start off us doing the lighter and darker sections. Like so. So now we're going to add some Vallejo White to the Moot green just to lighten that up. I'm going to start lightening up alternate sections of where the blade is and the actual body of the blade. So we're going to paint 3 sections on this blade edge with this lightened colour, and then we're also going to paint 2 sections in between those on the flat part at the back. We're going to do that on both sides and the little bit at the back, and also that smaller blade down at the bottom too. So these sections highlighted, we're now going to add a little bit more white, and we're just going to do the same sections again, but you're going to leave a mil or 2 of the previous shade visible at either end. Unless of course it's one of those sections at the very tip of the blade, you want the highlight to go all the way to the end of the blade. So these middle bits you want to have the previous shade shown at each end, and the top part and the bottom part you only want the previous shade showing on the part of the blade going towards the middle. The very tip you want that highlight going to the edge. So again, going to add a little bit more Vallejo White to the previous mix. We're going to leave again another little section of the previous layer at either end, except for the top and bottom of the blade. And we're just going to highlight those. You can start to see those shades going from the Moot green to the lighter shades there. You're doing this on both sides and that little back piece as well, and also the smaller blade at the bottom. As the layers go on, you'll start seeing this come together for the nice white highlights. So we're going to add a little bit more Vallejo White to the previous mix and do the same again, and you're going to repeat this process until finally you've got pure white in the very centre of those middle bits, and also in the very top and the bottom of the blade sections. Like so. So we're going to do one final mix, adding Vallejo White to the previous mix, and do one final highlight on the sections of the blade here. You now see a lot better how that is going from the Moot green colour to the lighter shades. If you do keep any of the previous shades available, it's handy for touching it up. If you don't, you can just mix a tiny spot of Moot green to one edge of the layer that you're doing, and you'll be able to make that previous shade dead easy and go over any little mistakes that you might make. Now I'm going to use pure Vallejo White. I'm just going to do a little section on each of these parts just to give that the final highlight where it's nice and bright on each bit. Now we're going to work on those darkened sections. So what we're going to do is use Citadel Biel-Tan green, and in the sections where you have that pure Moot green, you're going to leave a little strip of the Moot green against the highlighted part, and then you're going to work in the reverse way that you did the previous one, where you're going to be adding layers of Biel-Tan green, getting increasingly dark the further away you get from those lighter sections. So whereas we were doing it getting lighter in the middle of these parts before, we're now going to be getting darker. So again, we're going to be using Citadel Biel-Tan green once more, and we're just going to darken up those sections, leaving a thin layer or a thin strip with one layer of Biel-Tan green. And then we're just going to keep darkening up these sections the same way that we lightened the other sections, so that you have progressive layers of darkening Biel-Tan green. That will give you that nice dark part for each of the blades. Once more, a bit more Biel-Tan green, and leaving the previous two layers as they are. You're just going to add another section of Biel-Tan green in the middle of those, just to get them a little bit darker. You can see now that that's going from the light to the dark green quite nicely, and it's a really easy method of doing this. It saves mixing too many colours to darken it down, and it gives you that really nice deep green colour. Now I'm going to use some Vallejo White. What we're going to do here is we're going to trace the edges on the blade and around all the details on the blade to make those stand out. I tend to find getting a little bit of paint on the brush and then dragging the brush sideways across those edges does help pick them out. It's a bit more tricky when you've got these middle ones, because you need to use the very tip of the brush and drag it sideways and keep rotating the miniature so that you can catch each of those. Now we're going to use some Citadel technical paint, Tesseract Glow. I'm going to paint this on each of the areas that we painted white earlier, so his eyes, the globes, and also some of the tubes. On the eyes and the globes, you might want to do a little bit of a thin edge highlight around them, just so that you can make it look as though they're glowing a little bit. You also want to put a little bit more of the Tesseract Glow around the edges, so that they have that slightly darker look, so it looks like the middle of the circles is glowing. Now I'm just going to use a tiny little bit of Citadel Nuln Oil. I'm going to very carefully go around the edge of this symbol on his head here. Now, because you've got that white on there, the Vallejo Model Air Chrome would go over it, but it wouldn't show up as well as it could do. So we're just going to go around the edge of that very carefully, and then use some Vallejo Model Air Chrome just to get that nice shiny symbol on the Overlord's head. And that is the finished Necron Overlord. Really happy with how he turned out. It's a cracking miniature. It'll look very good leading the Necrons. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you have, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future content. Also, think about subscribing to some of our other social media, linked below. Thanks very much. If you like the channel and you enjoy the content and you'd like to support us, our Ko-fi and Patreon pages, linked below. Thanks very much.